I would like to speak in my talk about the historic recordings and why I found it was important to start looking into this source as maybe a relevant source for interpretations of earlier music, and how they brought me to perhaps new ideas about our historically informed performance practice nowadays. I would like to start my presentation by playing for you excerpts from two recordings of a sonata by Haydn, the third movement. The first one is of a pianist and a composer born in 1824. This is 3 years before Beethoven died, Karl Reinecke. Considered a pianist from highest class, he studied with Schumann, Mendelssohn, and Liszt. The second recording is of the same piece, but played this time by Evgeny Kissin, one of the grand names in the piano world today. From these recordings, we clearly hear how drastically performance style has changed over the past 100 years. These changes were driven partially by economic, social, and political factors, for example, the world wars and the development of industrialization, which deeply affected the art aesthetics of the 20th century. In music, it resulted in the rejection of heightened rhetorical expressivity and the portrayal of extreme emotional experiences in seeking correctness and self-awareness. Modernism was born. In addition to the rise of the recording industry playing an important role in the shaping of performance style as well, making performers aware of their mistakes and making them realize that now an audience will be hearing their recordings again and again, shifted performers' taste to seeking perfected, polished, fluent playing, which reduced the spontaneity and improvisatory character. So, where does the historically informed performance practice stand in all this? Let's go back a bit. The interest towards the early music and having it played on historical instruments is not an invention of the 20th century and dates back to 1832 when François Fétis was already organizing historical concerts on antique instruments. However, the tradition of early music performance that we follow today has its beginning in the mid-20th century with the rise of the so-called hip movement. Having its beginnings at the time of the modernism, it bears the aesthetic values of its time. It came as an opposition to the eloquent rhetorical expressivity and high emotionality of the Romantics and advocated objectivity and avoidance of individual input and interpretation to the score. The score became sacred. Since then, the hip movement has gone a long way of rethinking its approach. However, as Robert Hill wrote, open quote, the anti-romantic values are still deeply embedded in our assumptions towards the early repertoire, and they have crystallized into standards of good musicianship, end quote. Although today freedoms of personal expression and interpretation will be heard in performances, in general the freedoms allowed will be confined to our present-day taste in which we have grown up, being educated in, surrounded by. In other words, being conditioned to it. Furthermore, some most recent research shows that by comparing most up-to-date performances of hip musicians and the classical musicians, it seems that both practices have come close to each other, sharing similar aesthetic approach to music making. Hip conductors conduct modern orchestras and vice versa. Classical musicians take on a bit of Baroque because they like the music and to get some more gigs. And yet, all musicians competing on the same market are among some of the reasons for the similarities. Knowing that the aesthetics of the hip movement are essentially modernist, and therefore the interpretations of the treatises are from the perspective of our modern-day minds and imagination. And seeing the narrowing difference between hip and classical performances, do we have enough reason to keep following this tradition? And what can the options be? I looked for answers in the historic recordings. Having grown up in and therefore being conditioned to our own performance tradition, it was difficult to be objective to what exactly our performance style is. So my approach was based on making comparisons between modern hip performances and modern classical recordings of the Italian concerto by Bach, and those I placed in juxtaposition to historical recordings of the same piece. A first observation is that there is one aspect which greatly differs the old from the new, and that is the treatment of time. This results in three unique characteristics of the earlier performance style, expressed in rhythmic alteration, hand dislocation, and tempo modification and tempo rubato. Some of the modern recordings I chose were by Andras Schiff, who is one of the most celebrated interpreters of Bach on the piano, and Christophe Rousset, a leading figure in the mainstream historically informed performance harpsichord world. Those I compared to, first, Violet Gordon Woodhouse, the first to record Bach on the harpsichord. Busoni described her as one of the greatest keyboard artists of the time. The second recording was of Vladimir de Pachman, also considered one of the most imaginative pianists of the early 20th century. The comparison revealed striking realizations. First, both modern recordings share the same interpretative characteristics, to name a few: strictness to the rhythm, perfect hand synchronization, and absence of tempo modifications and tempo rubato. The old recordings are the complete opposite. For saving time, I will play now only the old recordings, and if anyone is interested, the modern recordings are widely available online. So now we will hear Violet Gordon Woodhouse. Is it okay? The second recording is of Vladimir de Pachman.
Which year is this? Which year was this recording?
This is 23.
23.
And the Vladimir de Pachman is, I believe, 27. Or 10. A bit of his second movement.
Is this a piano roll?
This is a piano roll, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I will have to stop so that there is time for everything. It will be easy to say that the historic recordings simply represent the romantic performance way, which has nothing to do with earlier periods. But would that be true? I'm far from suggesting that the historic recordings show us how performances were done in the earlier periods. However, what I suggest is that the recordings can give us a chance to reinterpret the prescriptive texts and understand them with new minds and ears. So let's look at those time characteristics separately. Rhythmic alteration. Here I include rhythmic inequalities and purposeful changes of the notated rhythm. What we hear, especially in the Pachman and a bit in Violet, is that often fast passages are played somehow dotted, either short, long, or the opposite. This you can see as an example here. In such cases, very often the notes are slightly dotted. The other rhythmic alteration is changing figures of two 30-second notes followed by a 16 note to triplets or vice versa. This type of alteration is prominent in the playing of Violet. As early music research has shown, rhythmic inequality has been described in treatises as early as the 16th century. Caccini and Frescobaldi presented in the 17th century, and French treatises talk extensively about it also in later periods. And it is not to say that in early music today we don't know or don't do note inégal. But today the prescribed rhythmic changes are interpreted from the position of modern taste limitation. Therefore, the recordings not only present the possibility for extreme rhythmic alterations in performance, but most importantly, they reveal to us a completely new quality and variety of treatment of rhythm. Hand dislocation. It is expressed through bass notes coming before the melody on strong beats, melody before bass, ornaments before the beat, and lack of synchronization due to alteration of the rhythm. For example, when each note in the melody is played slightly later than the written, a feeling of continuous syncopation is created. The effect is mostly heard in the slow movements of both historic recordings we heard. However, in the Pachman, it is present also in the fast movement. According to the written sources, the device was in use during the 19th century, as also we heard in the previous lecture of Tulia, although there was already the tendency for regarding it as over-sentimental. What is more interesting is that often the matter of continuous hand dislocation in fast movements was criticized by 19th century authors who were advocating for the new, stricter style. Such texts suggest that in earlier periods, hand dislocation must have been much wilder. In the French lute school, a practice of dislocation was described by Denis Gautier in 1672. In his Dictionnaire de la Musique from 1708, Brossard mentioned the term mezzo sospiro, or suspension, the realization of which is done by, open quote, keeping silent for the eighth part of the bar, end quote. This ornament was described also by François Couperin and looks like this, the little slur with a circle on top. The top line shows how it's written and the bottom line shows how it should be performed. More interesting, we can look at the next slide, which shows that this ornament is placed on every note in the top part, which suggests that every note of the top part is going to be performed slightly after the beat. In this kind of prescription, that will mean that perhaps the hands never played together. In his fourth suite from the pieces de clavecin in the sarabande, Fourcray also gives his instruction for what it seems hand dislocation, open quote. To make it intelligent, I have marked some little crosses which signify that it is necessary that the chords of the bass be played before those of the melody, and at all those places where there are no crosses, the melody must be played before the bass. End quote. From this it comes clear that if put in practice, the hands are not supposed to ever play together. A reminiscence of such extreme dislocation is quite evident in the Pachmann and Violet, in whose playing the lack of synchronization is the most extreme. Friedrich Marburg, in Principal du Clavecin, describes the French suspension as, open quote, an alternative way of notating the Italian style rubato, end quote. Tempo modification and tempo rubato. Tempo modification, I refer to changes of tempi of larger sections within a movement. On the two old recordings, we hear that when a character of a certain section changes, such is the case, for example, with the second theme in the first movement, the tempo of the whole section slows down. The first example which comes to mind describing changes of tempo in different sections according to the affetti is Frescobaldi. This is 17th century. Tempo rubato is also largely present in both recordings. The first type is changes in the melody, contributing to rhythmically free melodic line, accompanied with strict pulse in the bass. The second type is accelerandi and ritardandi, according to the expressive effect done in both hands. The rhythmic type of rubato is known as the earliest way of realizing rubato. According to the research done by Richard Hudson, it is described in treatises since the 14th century. Galliard in 18th century, for example, gives a page of how he gives the written out voice line, then he gives how it should be ornamented in practice, and in the third line he gives an example how it should be rhythmically changed in order that the main notes don't come with the bass note. Marburg also gives an example where he first gives the original melody line, and on the very low right corner you see the bass. All these other examples are the possibilities of how the top line can be varied rhythmically in order not to coincide with the bass. We also know the famous quote by Mozart when he wrote to his father that everyone was impressed by his way of making rubato, but he says that nobody realizes that he is actually keeping strict time in the bass, and that's how it should be executed, tempo rubato in an adagio. Accelerandi and ritardandi is the other type of rubato, which according to Hudson is reserved mostly for practices from the late 18th century. However, 18th century sources on French opera give indication that changes of the tempi according to the momentary mood are desirable. Frescobaldi also talks about changes of tempi now speeding up, now slowing down, according to the effect. The last source I suggest that represents a link between 18th and 19th century performance practice and as such suggests the idea of some continuation of performance traditions, is the 18th century barrel organ recordings. This source until now has not received much attention as an adequate source for performance practice. However, to me it reveals shocking similarities with late 19th century performances. Let's hear an example. The first two are transcriptions of Handel's Organ Concerto Opus 4 No. 5 made by Christopher Smith around 1774. He was an assistant to Handel. Here is the score, it's a bit small, but... The
Where
next,
did you find these?
well, these are specifically in the Clock Museum in Utrecht, also along with the others that I will show. I obtained them from another scholar, but they're, I think, much more in the museum, and that's... this was the third movement. Now we are going to hear the last movement. Oh, sorry. In addition to being a remarkable source for ornamentation, they give also one more interesting clue. It is that fast movements which are the ones which bear all rhythmic inequality as well as lack of synchronization rather than the slow movements. We can hear the slow movements are quite aligned, which also makes me feel that it is possible on this equipment to make aligned or not aligned. However, the way of executing the ornamentation in the slow movement makes occasionally the ornamented notes to come before or after the beat, which can be referred to what is described as tempo rubato in the earlier sources we saw. The next example is one of the three clock organs built by Primitivius Nemec. He was the court librarian to Prince Esterhazy. The preparation was supervised by Heinrich himself. example. So now, after hearing this, let's go back and hear Karl Reinecke 100 years later playing Haydn. I find that when it comes to treatment of rhythm, the recordings are shockingly similar. The barrel organ represents the same dotting of fast passages and also extreme hand dislocation. From what I know is that such aspects can be preserved objectively on the barrel organ because the pinning is done manually and therefore is a matter of choice. Is a matter of choice. Also, the fact that some passages are in perfect synchronization and strict rhythm and others are not suggests to me that the places which are not synchronized are artistic choice rather than a fallacy of the equipment. We should not forget that Haydn prepared these recordings for the Prince of Esterhazy. It was a special gift, and he put all his effort and taste into this. The fact that the barrel organ was considered to render close to a live performance results and was often replacing the organ players in churches comes to show that the art of pinning and production of this instrument has been highly sophisticated, giving good performance results. Charles Burney, for example, says that the recent improvements of some English artists have rendered the barrel capable of producing an effect equal to the fingers of the first-rate performer. How revealing the barrel organ can be for tempo modification is still something to be investigated further, but as Ort Ume quotes a historic source in his book on mechanical organs, open quote, "Rallentando in excess can result in the embarrassing experience of losing wind in the middle of the piece," end quote. Therefore, I would assume that extreme tempo modifications, although done in real practice, will not be practically possible on this instrument. The study of the very early recordings and the treatises revealed for me a world of possibilities for reimagining our performance practice. I believe that the value of learning from the recordings is in the opportunity for us to realize our own performance practice limitations, transform and give new definition to expression through seeking truth. It also gave me a glimpse over the problematic nature of our hip performance tradition. Clearly, what happened in the 60s with the rise of the so-called hip movement was the establishment of certain ideas and certain people who nurtured the movement. But what happened before that? We know of a few famous harpsichord players prior to Leonhardt, among whom was Wanda Landowska and Ralph Kirkpatrick, but were they the only ones? To my greatest astonishment, I discovered that in fact there were numerous harpsichord players recording Baroque music on a highly professional level throughout the first half of the 20th century. What struck me the most was that many of them, if not most of them, were women. It is shocking how little is known about them today, although it seems that some of them even had high aspirations about finding historical instruments and perhaps being interested into the historical practices. My research in this area is still to be developed, but I would like to share a selection of some of my current findings along with a few recordings. The first lady I would like to mention is Isolde Algrim. A Viennese harpsichordist and forte pianist born in 1914. From the biography written by Peter Watchhorn, it is known that she was the first to use original Viennese forte piano for the performance of Mozart, was the first to record the art of fugue, and was the first to argue for the performance of that piece in its original form as a keyboard work, and this is during the 50s. She gave the first performance of the musical offering with harnoncourt, with the instruments tuned to a lower pitch and using gut strings. The validity and quality of the research presented by Watchhorn is still to be re-examined, but it seems that she might have been a main figure right around the time of Leonhard's rise, but it is rather forgotten today. And I would play a short recording, a short excerpt from the Chromatic Fantasy and Fugue, because it has been a theme today. And I would open perhaps just the question about freedom and about improvisation, which I guess was the first inspiration behind this piece. To stop.
Wow, that was awesome
Yeah. The next lady is Paul de Lestan. Completely forgotten today. I managed so far to find only a short article on her, and it is in French, and I don't speak French. She led a very rich career being a pianist, singer, harpsichordist, and a pedagogue. Settled in Lyon, she taught at the conservatory and premiered works by many composers of the time, including Ravel. She also toured the US, and some writings regarding those concerts reveal that, open quote, Madame de Lestang immediately became an artist of great sensitivity, with a mastery full of authority of the technique so particular of the harpsichord. Her touch is lightness itself, and her fingers are agile and safe in all passages of complex writing. Mrs. de Lestang is an expert on her instrument. The next lady, Pauline Aubert, completely unknown today. Until now, I still have not managed to find any biographical entry on her. However, what she has left behind is number of recordings of Baroque music, many of them revealing extraordinary musicianship and sensitivity. And here is an example of Geelvinck. Alice Ehlers, Austrian-born American harpsichordist and teacher, she was the first student of Wanda Landowska. She studied piano with Theodor Leschetizky. According to a biographical entry in the book Albert Schweitzer and Alice Ehlers, she was obsessed with the antique instruments and searched greatly for them in museums in order to learn from them. In the 50s, she became the professor in University of Southern California, and from the little known about her, she was a leading harpsichordist of the day. Anne Linde made the first complete record of harpsichord concerto, and this was the concerto in G minor by Bach. Still, I haven't found much biographical entries, but her many recordings are dated from the mid-20s. I will skip her recording. Julia Menz. As a harpsichordist, she celebrated her first great success at the German Bach Festival in 23, then 24th, and then 25th. In the 30s, she was considered one of the most famous harpsichordists. There are several other names to be researched and mentioned, but for now I would give the final spot to a very special lady from Australia, Louise Henson Dyer, born in 1884 in Melbourne, in a wealthy family, having a background as a pianist and being married to a very rich businessman. She became a patron of the arts and established the publishing company Éditions de Lucieux-Lira, with main aim to make available early music that had never been published before. The first volumes were done in 1932 and presented the complete work of François Couperin. In 1933, for the celebration of the composer's bicentenary, she also organized 3 concerts, one of them using a harpsichord dated 1737. What was the instrument and who played on it is still to be discovered. Together with the publication of books and scores, during the 50s, the company extended to also record company, so they have a lot of LP records. To conclude, although I agree that through the study and imitation of practices heard on the recorded sources, we can come closer to a historical authenticity, I believe that the greater value of this path is in, first, giving us the chance to liberate ourselves from the constraints of the modern taste limitations, and second, in revealing possibilities to enrich our imagination and emotional experiences, and in doing so, finding our own authenticity. Furthermore, the historic recordings, being often the only source revealing the existence of long-forgotten harpsichord players, perhaps can give us a key towards a whole new chapter in the history of the early music revival. The questions standing are more than the answers. Who are these players, and why it seems they have been swept away from the history of the revival? What was their relation to each other, if any? What were their aesthetic views, and what tastes and knowledge lies behind their performance style? What is the scale of their influence? I believe that the search for the answers and the hidden truths of the revival might urge us to rethink and reimagine history and tradition, and help us find our own truth in the field of early music. Thank you.